The pickaxe didn't thud into frozen earth, it rang. A sharp, violent, metallic vibration that shuddered up the wooden handle and shattered the freezing December silence of 1835. Above ground, lower Manhattan was a blackened corpse. 700 buildings reduced to frozen ash in a single night. A conflagration so absolute that water turned to ice before it ever reached the flames. But the authentic narrative of New York's darkest winter didn't unfold in the smoldering ruins of the financial district. It originated below the streets, beneath the debris, beneath the authorized architectural strata. The recovery teams had just breached something that wasn't supposed to be there, an infrastructure excessively precise for any recognized manufacturer. Assemblies fitted so flawlessly that even through the inadequate illumination of 1,835 lanterns, no joinery was discernible. What they uncovered in the subterranean dark would threaten the entire accepted chronology of human progress. And within months, it would be deliberately, permanently erased from history. When historians recount the year 1835 in New York, their focus inevitably settles on the catastrophe above ground. The Great Fire that ravaged the city's heart is documented in exhaustive, meticulous detail. The newspapers chronicled the merchant houses collapsing into the narrow streets, the copper roofs melting into rivers of green fire, the sheer apocalyptic scale of an inferno that consumed America's financial capital. The narrative is one of triumph over tragedy, a testament to American resilience and the indomitable spirit of 19th century industry. But this is merely the superficial layer of history. The authorized version, the one printed in textbooks and recited in civic monuments. The genuine story commenced with a straightforward, purely practical directive: clear the wreckage. In the immediate aftermath of the inferno, engineers received strict, urgent orders from the city's surviving elite. They were to excavate the burnt district, stabilize the foundations across 17 devastated city blocks, and determine whether the scorched earth could bear the immense weight of a reconstructed commercial center. It was a salvage operation, nothing more. The merchants of Wall Street, Broad Street, and Exchange Place needed to know if their subterranean vaults had survived the heat, if the deep brick cellars could be reused, if the literal substrate of the island remained structurally sound enough to support a new era of commerce. The conditions were a sensory nightmare. The winter of 1835 was merciless. Temperatures plummeted so drastically that the East River froze solid, locking ships in their berths. Laborers, wrapped in rigid layers of wool and coated in the greasy, pervasive soot of the burnt city, descended into the cratered remains of the financial district. They carried iron bars, heavy shovels, and whale oil lanterns, plunging into the subterranean darkness to assess the damage. Initially, the recovery crews attempted to categorize everything in the most elementary manner conceivable. They documented the collapsed masonry, the shattered timber beams, the obsolete hydraulic equipment. They cataloged the deserted manufacturing remnants fused from pre-conflagration workshops. It was a gruesome, exhausting catalog of 19th century ruin. But as the excavation penetrated deeper into the frost-hardened earth, the documentation began to falter. The debris ceased resembling the ruins of contemporary commerce. When the recovery teams advanced past the initial, recognizable strata beneath the burnt district, their expectations were entirely conventional. They believed they would encounter standard sub-basements, perhaps some antiquated utility conduits, forgotten smuggling tunnels from the Revolutionary era, or dispersed remnants from earlier Dutch colonial construction. Nothing unusual, nothing extraordinary, just the buried mundane past of a growing metropolis. But within weeks, that presumption was entirely shattered, because instead of an orderly, chronological sequence of historical foundations, the teams revealed a succession of technological strata that simply did not behave the way the infrastructure of a conventional city is supposed to behave. The instant laborers began penetrating through the deepest layers of charred basement, something wholly unanticipated occurred. They breached a threshold. They broke through what they initially assumed was bedrock, only to discover it was a false floor of compacted, chemically hardened earth. They dropped into chambers that had remained sealed for generations, not collapsed, not abandoned and filled with the gradual sediment of time, deliberately, perfectly sealed. Below the merchant houses, at depths far exceeding any documented cellar's reach in the municipal archives, the digging teams suddenly found themselves standing in spaces that corresponded to no building registry on Earth. Their configuration was bewildering. Their function defied all logical explanation. And the machinery they contained bore absolutely no resemblance to anything in the mechanical encyclopedias of that era. It didn't echo British industrial engineering, which was the gold standard of the time. It didn't match the burgeoning, rough-hewn American manufacturing techniques. It was something else entirely. Something misplaced, something terrifyingly anachronistic. The chambers were not isolated anomalies. They were not the eccentric, forgotten basement projects of a mad inventor. They were connected. The next impossible revelation was the sheer, staggering interconnection of the systems. Each layer, the known basements above, the unknown sub-basements below, and whatever vast complex existed even deeper, appeared to adhere to identical energy distribution systems. They shared identical conduit configurations. They operated on identical, unfathomable engineering principles. Different eras shouldn't exhibit that. Different builders, operating with different purposes across different centuries, do not construct in flawless integration with systems from generations prior. When a new civilization builds over an old one, they crush the past. They lay new pipes over old stone. They sever the old lines. Yet beneath New York, they did the exact opposite. Conduits from one period connected directly to conduits buried meters below them. Energy distribution networks maintained the exact same trajectory, even when separated by what appeared to be entire building cycles and tons of sediment. It was as though every single group that had ever built on this terrain was blindly connecting to or building directly upon an original master infrastructure, an infrastructure that no longer existed in any engineering archive. The conduits themselves made no sense for 1830s technology. They were fashioned with guide channels that were utterly useless for steam or hydraulic power. They were integrated into the walls themselves, positioned at precise geometric angles that defied conventional fluid dynamics. They were embedded in stonework that clearly predated any electrical system New York officially possessed. They made absolute sense, however, for something that conducted energy through resonance or electromagnetic principles. Layer by layer, the ground beneath the financial district ceased to appear like a sequence of construction phases. It became a repository of buried secrets, a location built, rebuilt, and interred multiple times, yet perpetually resting upon the same enigmatic grid. It generated a deeply uncomfortable prospect in the minds of the men swinging the pickaxes. The buildings above ground, the banks, the trading houses, the heart of the American economy, did not merely rest on natural bedrock. They were sitting on top of something considerably larger. A colossal power generation system whose function was never recorded, never taught, and never clarified in the authorized history of the civilization. And then arrived the feature that still confounds contemporary researchers who managed to view the surviving, unredacted archival photographs. The discovery that forced the engineers to realize they were not just looking at old buildings, but at a machine, the spherical power cores. When the laborers pushed into the deepest northern quadrant of the excavation zone, the narrow, perfectly carved geometric passages suddenly opened into a cavernous space. The air here was strangely dead. It was entirely devoid of the damp, rotting sewage smell of the city above. It smelled sterile, metallic. Resting in the center of these geometrically perfect rooms were massive metallic spheres. Officially, in the heavily redacted ledgers compiled months later, these would be hastily labeled as antiquated cisterns or abandoned boiler apparatus. But nothing about them corresponded to typical water storage or steam generation. These cores were excessively symmetrical, excessively precisely machined, and excessively perfectly sealed. It was as though they were designed with implements capable of maintaining tolerances we associate exclusively with contemporary aerospace manufacturing, not the soot-stained foundries of the 1830s. Certain cores were substantial enough for several men to occupy the inside. Others contained complex internal mechanisms that, upon close inspection, appeared deliberately designed for rotation at tremendous velocities. Workers from 1835 described them in private, terrified correspondence as engineered vessels. Workers from 1835 described them in private, terrified correspondence as engineered vessels, though no engineer in the city could specify what that purpose might have been. The surfaces of these spheres displayed peculiar, haunting characteristics. Intricate, crystalline patterns were embedded directly into the metal. There were geometric etchings that appeared specifically designed to channel energy, and the alloys themselves were something the leading metallurgists of the era couldn't classify. When struck with a tool, the metal didn't thud like iron. It didn't ring hollow like brass, it resonated. a deep, sustained, low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate directly in the teeth and bones of the men standing near it. Some materials appeared to respond to the magnetic compasses carried by the surveyors in ways that shouldn't be possible with the known metals of the period. But the spherical cores were merely the vestibule, the anteroom to the true heart of the complex. In the deepest section of the interconnected subterranean grid, beneath the massive silent spheres, the laborers located a secondary threshold. It wasn't a door in the traditional sense. It was a massive, circular iris of overlapping metallic plates, perfectly counterweighted and flush with the wall. It took 12 men utilizing heavy iron pry bars and complex pulley leverage to force the mechanism to turn. When the plates finally gave way, sliding back into the walls with a smooth, terrifyingly quiet hum of ancient bearings, a rush of stale, ozone-tasting air exhaled into the tunnel. It was the smell of a thunderstorm, trapped underground for centuries. Through the opening, the flickering light of their whale oil lanterns caught something that defied every law of nature and physics they comprehended. They weren't looking at empty utility spaces. They weren't looking at more metal tanks. They were looking at the crystalline chambers. The light from the whale oil lanterns did not simply illuminate the crystalline chambers, it was consumed by them. As the recovery teams crossed the threshold of the massive, overlapping metallic iris, the shadows they cast did not behave naturally. The geometrically perfect walls of the cavernous space caught the flickering yellow flames and refracted them through towering, translucent formations. These were not naturally occurring geodes. They were cut, faceted, and structurally integrated into the metallic architecture of the room itself. They were components, the laborers of 1835, men accustomed to the brutal, deafening roar of coal furnaces. And the hissing violence of steam pressure stood in absolute, paralyzed silence. They were staring at a power taxonomy that completely defied their comprehension. The walls surrounding these crystalline structures bore the undeniable violent scars of sustained energy output. But it was not the soot-stained char of combustion, it was electromagnetic scoring. The metallic surfaces were etched with fractal, branching burn patterns, Lichtenberg figures permanently scarred into alloys that 19th century science had not yet named. These were the unmistakable signatures of high-frequency, extreme voltage energy arcing across conductive materials. This revelation immediately answered the burning question that had plagued the surveyors since they first charted the impossible conduits. The reason these channels, guides, and pipes made absolutely no sense for steam or hydraulic engineering was that they were never meant to carry physical fluid. They operated on resonance. They were designed to channel ambient electromagnetic energy in etheric current. It was a power generation grid that harvested and distributed energy through geometric amplification and crystalline resonance, entirely bypassing the primitive need to burn earthly fuel. But as the men stood in that ozone-scented dark, shivering in their soot-caked wool, the awe rapidly mutated into an insidious, creeping paranoia. Because shortly after these deepest chambers were breached, a sudden, drastic shift occurred in the behavior of the upper management. The city engineers, the wealthy merchants funding the excavation, and the municipal overseers had initially demanded daily, exhaustive reports. They wanted every shattered brick and usable sub-basement meticulously cataloged. But the moment the reports of the spherical cores and the crystalline resonance chambers reached the surface, the directives abruptly changed. The frantic demands for exploration ceased. In their place arrived a suffocating, deliberate quietness. It didn't happen with a dramatic proclamation in the newspapers. The suppression of the subterranean complex was executed with the chilling, bureaucratic efficiency of a city desperate to protect its foundational myths. The head surveyors who had been meticulously charting the interconnected grid were suddenly reassigned. The detailed, highly technical field notes detailing the electromagnetic scoring and the unknown alloys were quietly confiscated from the foreman's tents. The tone of the official documentation transformed literally overnight. Where early entries in the excavation logs were assured, expansive, and technically curious, the late winter ledgers became deliberately vague. The language shifted from forensic to dismissive. The sprawling, perfectly machined grid was suddenly reclassified in the margins of official reports with aggressively mundane terminology. Anomalous debris, pre-fire industrial refuse, collapsed cistern architecture. And then, the unthinkable orders were handed down to the laborers freezing in the mud. They were not told to dismantle the machinery. They were not instructed to haul the magnificent, impossible technology to the surface for academic study, or to reverse engineer the flawless metallic spheres for the glory of American industry. They were ordered to bury it. The backfilling operation of early 1836 remains one of the most glaring, nonsensical contradictions in the authorized history of New York's reconstruction. The city was allegedly desperate for solid foundations to rebuild its financial heart. They needed stable, load-bearing cellar spaces. Yet instead of utilizing these profoundly stable, geometrically perfect subterranean chambers, the recovery teams were forced to manually pack them with tons of earth, ash, and rubble. But it wasn't a random burying, it was a targeted surgical obfuscation. The laborers noticed it immediately. The spaces that were ordered to be closed first, packed so densely with fill that men broke their shovels against the compacted dirt, were consistently the chambers containing the most anomalous machinery. They were bearing the evidence. Why would the city mandate the immediate, frantic sealing of the most structurally sound spaces beneath the fire zone? They were leaving the crushed, precarious brick basements of the 1820s exposed for ongoing use. Yet they were frantically shoveling dirt over the flawless joinery they had discovered just weeks prior. The seamless metal walls, the assemblies fitted so perfectly that no tool mark was visible. In Frostrum, the very spaces that could have supported the weight of 10 merchant houses were ruthlessly interred. It defies all conventional engineering logic, unless, of course, the discoveries posed a different variety of threat. Not a physical threat to the buildings above, a historical threat to the men constructing them. If the infrastructure beneath New York genuinely demonstrated engineering centuries ahead of 1830s capability, and if that machinery didn't match any known manufacturer, any known nation, or any accepted chronological timeline, then the entire fragile narrative of American technological progression begins to disintegrate. To acknowledge the resonance chambers was to acknowledge that the 19th century industrialists were not the apex of human achievement. They were merely children building wooden shacks on top of the ruins of gods. The wealthy elite of 1835, the titans who controlled the banks, the railroads, and the burgeoning industrial monopolies, required a narrative of linear, unbroken progress. They needed the masses to believe that civilization was perpetually advancing under their guidance. An anachronistic, highly advanced civilization existing right beneath their feet shattered that orthodoxy. It proved that human history was not a steady climb upward. It was a cycle of profound peaks and catastrophic, erased valleys. And perhaps that is exactly why the 1835 discoveries were so discreetly, violently reburied. Not to safeguard the structural integrity of Wall Street, but to safeguard the psychological paradigm of the modern world. Yet the suppression was not entirely flawless. The quietness could not erase everything. During the brief chaotic window between the initial breach of the deep sub-basements and the mandated backfilling operation, documentation was created. And this is where the mystery of the 1835 excavation transcends mere rumor and enters the realm of suppressed, undeniable physical evidence. The photographs. In the mid-1830s, photography was in its absolute infancy. The daguerreotype process was barely being standardized, requiring long, agonizing exposure times and incredibly toxic chemical processing in darkened laboratories. It was an expensive, rare technology, usually reserved for portraiture of the extreme elite. Yet early, experimental photographic plates were captured in the freezing depths beneath the incinerated district. Surveyors, perhaps realizing the historical impossibility of what they were witnessing, brought rudimentary, heavy camera apparatuses down into the subterranean dark. They set up their magnesium flashes and exposed silver-coated copper plates to the reality of the anachronistic machinery. These salvage photographs, processed in darkened, improvised offices, while New York reconstructed itself with astonishing velocity above ground, reveals something entirely contradictory to the official ledgers. The surviving images, the ones that escape the systematic confiscation, are deeply unsettling. They demonstrate workers positioned beside metallic enclosures, carved with a precision that defies the era. They show men standing next to housing so massive they appear miniature by comparison. They capture the crystalline resonance chambers, the long exposures blurring the flickering lanterns but perfectly resolving the razor-sharp, geometric lines of the ancient power grid. Tolerances and assemblies that resemble mid-20th century aerospace manufacturing far more than anything 1830s America is credited with. But the most troubling detail about these photographs is not what materialized on the silver plates. It is what happened to them afterward. The detailed images were never assembled into a single municipal report. They were never submitted to the Patent Office. They were never published in the broadsheets to celebrate the mysteries of the deep earth. Instead, they were deliberately fractured. The official municipal archives were scrubbed of any visual evidence that contradicted the narrative of crude colonial basements. The most explicit, undeniable photographs, the ones clearly showing the spherical cores and the impossible alloys, were quietly absorbed into the private locked collections of the city's wealthiest families and the engineering overseers. They became generational secrets, hidden in vault boxes and private libraries, entirely removed from the public domain. This archival scrubbing wasn't accidental misplacement. It was the deliberate, systematic starvation of the historical record. When you examine the final weeks of the 1835 recovery operation, the totality of the cover-up becomes impossible to disregard. The project didn't conclude, it was halted. The deep excavation zones were walled off with heavy, new brickwork. The massive, overlapping metallic iris that led to the resonance chambers was buried behind tons of imported masonry. The surface of the financial district was leveled, the scorched earth paved over, and new heavy foundations were poured directly on top of the packed dirt that now concealed the greatest technological discovery of the millennium. They sealed it, they filled it, they feigned to forget it. The authorized history books were printed. The Great Fire of 1835 was cemented in the civic memory simply as a tragedy of cold weather and wooden buildings. The rebuilding of the financial district was hailed as a triumph of modern capitalism. The subterranean reality was officially expunged from memory, but we must step back and observe the entire, terrifying configuration. The precision machinery was interred. The unknown resonating alloys were interred. The interconnected 17-block energy distribution systems were interred. The crystalline chambers were interred. The spherical power cores capable of rotational velocities that would tear a steam engine to shrapnel were interred. And they are still there. This is the ultimate macro-level realization that the 1835 cover-up was designed to prevent. The catastrophic secret that resolves the entire mystery of the subterranean grid. The impossible machinery beneath the ash was not a forgotten factory. It was not a failed 19th century experiment. It was an etheric power plant, an integrated, highly advanced, citywide energy grid belonging to an entirely different, anachronistic civilization that predated the recognized history of North America. A civilization that possessed a profound understanding of electromagnetism, resonance, and material science that we are only now beginning to vaguely approximate. A civilization that did not burn the earth to power its cities, but harmonized with its frequencies. And for one brief, accidental instant in the frozen December of 1835, the earth opened just enough to reveal it. The fire burned away the superficial layer of our accepted reality, exposing the vast, humming truth of the erased epic beneath, which brings us to the final, haunting inquiry. An inquiry no archive, no textbook, no authorized publication has ever dared to answer comprehensively. If New York City, the crown jewel of the modern financial world, stands squarely on top of a suppressed, technologically advanced infrastructure constructed by a civilization we no longer acknowledge, then what else lies beneath the cities of the world? What other fires, what other convenient earthquakes, what other catastrophic destructions cleared the surface of the earth just long enough for someone to bury what existed below? London, Paris, Chicago, San Francisco. How many of our modern metropolises are simply resting on the shoulders of ancient, buried machines? How many modern foundations are just concrete poured hastily over perfectly machined, seamless metal? The 1835 etheric power plants beneath New York were merely a glimpse. A brief, terrifying, accidental glimpse into a version of history we were never, ever meant to witness. The elites of the 19th century did everything in their power to blind us to it. They altered the ledgers, they buried the flawless joints, they hid the photographs, but they couldn't bury the questions. And now that glimpse is your clue, it is your chart. It is your formal invitation to question absolutely everything we think we comprehend about how our world was genuinely constructed and who truly constructed it. The narrative of steady, linear human progress is a comforting fiction designed to keep us looking upward at the glass skyscrapers, completely blind to the anomalies beneath the pavement. Because if an entire city-spanning etheric power grid survived under one city, silently waiting in the dark to be accidentally breached by a freezing labor. Imagine what still hums in the darkness beneath the rest. Something misplaced, something anachronistic. Listen closely the next time the city sleeps. Beneath the rumble of the subway trains, beneath the rush of the modern water mains, beneath the authorized strata of our manufactured reality, somewhere down there in the absolute dark, past the crushed bricks and the backfilled earth, the pickaxe is still ringing,